sip of tea here. Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored. In this episode of What Is On My Wrist, we're talking big crowns, baby. That's right, we've already talked about big crowns, but this 6538 is a treasure and it's a cool one and I couldn't help myself. I totally wanted to share this with you guys. So this one is slightly different than the other one that we reviewed, and I thought it would make kind of a good comparison and contrast video to the one that we already have. And since 6538s are very iconic and they're, you know, really cool and interesting, since we have one that is slightly different, I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of show you the difference between two 6538s and kind of talk about the differences between both of them. What's interesting about this specific 6538 from 1958 is it's commonly referred to as a 4-line dial. And where that basically comes from is we have at the 6 o'clock position on the dial, we've got our depth rating, our model, in this case it's the Submariner, no duh. And then what we have is an OCC text. So what OCC is, officially certified chronometer. And you know, within the 6538s, you have non-OCC watches and OCC watches, right? The difference between those two watches is simple yet complex. One, there's 4 lines of text on this dial, whereas non-chronometer rated watches only have 2 lines of text on the dial, the depth rating, and then ultimately the model name, Submariner, right? But the 4 lines of text on the dial, basically you have this OCC, you know, officially certified chronometer element of text on the dial. And that makes these very special and interesting because not all 6538s were officially certified chronometers. It's said that about 30% of the 6538s received a chronometer rated, you know, 1030 caliber Rolex automatic movement, whereas the rest of them didn't. So what's kind of cool about that is it's almost like comparing a no-date Submariner like the 5512 versus the 5513. Same situation here. The difference is that instead of having 2 separate model designations for a different caliber and type of movement, we have basically one reference number and then you just have different dial variants, which, you know, kind of display the upgraded movement in one versus the other. So, you know, it's interesting. Early on, we had basically the same watch, but ultimately they were different. So the same watch under the same reference with different movements and kind of a different feature set, right? But in the later era of Rolex, we have 2 separate models for basically the same watch with slight different little features and things like that. So kind of unique. It's no secret, 6538 is an icon and a legend. The Rolex Submariner is literally the purest representation of a diver's tool watch, period. The 6538, nicknamed by the aficionado, dealer, collector community, is the Big Crown. So that nickname, the Big Crown, comes from the fact that the Big Crown has a big crown, has an oversized winding crown. What's interesting is that this 6538 was also produced alongside of like the 5508 and the 6205 Submariners. The major difference there is the size of the crown. The case is slightly different, and then also the crystal. So the 5508s and the 6205s, you know, they didn't have a 660-foot depth rating. They didn't have a 200-meter depth rating, whereas this did because of the larger crown, different case, and obviously a larger Superdome crystal, which was much more water resistant. So I think, you know, the difference is that the 5508s and the 6205s, those could have been viewed as professional watches, but I think that this is almost kind of like comparing like a Sea Dweller to like, let's say like a 5513 or something like that, right? I think that these watches were regarded as much more professional based watches, increased depth rating, large oversized winding crown. You know, I think that's ultimately what makes these special, and also why Rolex was kind of offering a couple different models of the Submariner, whereas if we go into the 1960s and into the 1980s and so on and so forth, the only real major difference outside of maybe some movement and dial configurations is really date or no date. So really interesting. Nicknamed the James Bond Submariner, Sean Connery, he wore a 6538 and he wore a 4-line. So really interesting kind of element of pop culture. The 6538s and most big crowns, even if they're, you know, a sub variant or something like that, they always have the nickname, you know, the Bond Sub, even though the 5508s and the 6205s have also kind of received that nickname, the Bond Sub. The true Bond Sub is, you know, basically a 4-line 6538. So really interesting. Let me take you through the details of this example. I'm really excited about this example because it's a watch that has remained in really good condition. It's got a very strong case, it's got a beautiful dial, and it also retains its original red triangle insert, which is kind of the cherry on the top for us. So the case is really, really strong. The watch wears, I would kind of say similar to maybe like a 5513 or something like that. The big oversized crown kind of, really does it for me. Matter of fact, if you wouldn't mind handing me one watch that we featured here on the show a lot is Tudor Black Bay. This is one of my favorite watches. I'm a vintage watch guy, I'm a vintage watch dealer. I specialize in vintage watches, right? But one of my favorite watches is the Tudor Black Bay 58. And if we actually compare them side by side, even as Nick pointed out, they kind of look a little bit similar, right? Kind of cool, right? This is from 58 and I think this is from 2019. This is a watch that I love wearing because I can wear this, I can take it in the pool, I can knock it on door jams, and this one, if I took it in the pool and knocked it on a door jam, I would probably kill myself. The pricing of this is a lot different than the pricing of this. But with that being said, I like that no crown guard case. I love, the red triangle insert, which is really eye-catching. And ultimately, even though the Black Bay 58 is quite a bit different, it does have some crossover between, the 6538, which I think is part of the reason why the Black Bays and the Tudor Black Bay 58s in specific have been, very, very popular. So it doesn't quite wear like a 40, but kind of wear similar to Black Bay 58, kind of similar to, let's say, like a 5513, but ultimately different on the wrist because you don't have those crown guards and the case is, the lugs aren't as long and the case is a little bit more squatty, but it's, kind of a bit of a chunk as well. The case on this specific example is really, really impressive. The watch came to us from a well-known collector who shall not be named. Don't worry, your secret is safe with us. But the case was probably detailed at some point. What's interesting about early Submariners in specific is, everybody's all about unpolished and chamfers this and chamfers that. Totally get you. Totally suckling on that teat as well, don't get me wrong. But one thing that is interesting is that the chamfers or the finishing on, like a 5508 or a 6205 or a 6538, et cetera, in the no crown guard subs are very broad and wide. Additionally, the sides of the case are very much flat, right? So that's kind of something that we see here in the Black Bay 58 as well, is like flat side case. There's no kind of oyster case or rounding to the case. This case remains in really, really good condition. Based on my experience and in my opinion, I think that the case may have been touched up slightly at some point, but there's a lot of meat left on these cases. And what's interesting is that I was talking with a collector the other day who was actually looking at this watch, and he had bought these watches in the late 90s for like, $3,000 and $4,000. And so to give you perspective, this watch obviously is well above that. This watch is in the $230,000 range. That always wasn't the case. The fact of the matter is that these watches were ultimately at one point in time kind of just used for their intended purposes. They were dive watches, and ultimately they were watches that were accessible, similar to like most things, like vintage Porsche 911s, Gibson Carina Flying V's from 1958, Paul Newman Daytonas, right? There wasn't the enthusiast and collector community and an archive and repository of information like there is now today, which allows us to realize how rare and special these things are, which ultimately change the price point. So in any case, this case is really, really nice. It's in really sharp and nice condition. I think, based on my experience, it's my opinion that the case was maybe lightly touched up at some point, but not in a bad way. It retains its original brass bezel. So not a lot of people know this, but the original Submariners didn't have a steel bezel. They actually had a brass bezel, which was, I believe, chrome plated at the time. This one's kind of cool because you kind of still see some of that plating, but some of the yellow brass is kind of coming through. And then it also retains its original red triangle insert, which is also very, very special. Inserts had a tendency to break and kind of pop out of the watches or degrade and fade over time, but that red triangle really is eye-catching. And again, kind of going back to the Black Bay 58, it's really noticeable when on wrist. So interestingly too, we did an Instagram post, and if you're not doing so already, be sure to follow us on Instagram, but we did an Instagram post kind of talking about the luminous material that is used on the 6538s and other watches from that era. One interesting thing to note is that the 6 o'clock marker actually has a luminous material that glows like an intense bright green, and that was by design. There's been some theory that Rolex did that intentionally, so that way you had a kind of a highlighted point of reference on the dial for, keeping time and things like that. obviously rotating diving bezel. And then you also have a white sweep seconds hand in the 1958 versions of watches. And you can see that in like 6610s and some other watches as well, where you have a very high profile white sweep seconds hand, with some variants actually being a white lollipop sweep seconds hand, or kind of the smaller lollipop at the end, like this one. Gilt dial, obviously. The dial on this watch is Swiss only, gilt chapter ring. The hands are also gilted. On wrist, this watch is just, stunning. The bracelet on this example is a little bit later, so it was probably replaced at, a service interval. The cool thing is this does have an oyster stretch bracelet. So, Rolex's idea behind offering an oyster stretch bracelet was that you could basically have this watch be sized to your wrist properly, but if you were to enter the water in on a dive, you could, basically slide it over your wetsuit, and that would, allow you some extra flexibility while, still not changing the bracelet sides. So that's kind of a cool and nifty little feature. They're really interesting watches. They are quickly climbing in price. I mean, we've seen 6538s hit 500,000. There's even some rare kind of early prototypey type of examples that have gone for over $1 million. I've been in the auction room when that has happened, and they are true, collector's items and pieces of art. There's not that many of them, and the ones that are out there typically, go into a collection and they disappear into that collection. They don't resurface a lot. So really special opportunity for us to talk about this. We typically get about 1 to 2 big crowns per year. If that gives you any indication. Datejust, we probably get 5,000 of them a year. I have no idea. But in any case, really, really cool watch, and was very excited to share this with you. And also wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the difference between a 2-line and a 4-line, and kind of talk about the story behind, that movement. So in any case, thanks again, guys, for tuning in. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you haven't done so already, check us out on Instagram. And if you've got watch questions, we're here and happy to help. Drop us a line at info@craftandtailored.com. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you guys in the next one.